Hello everyone, my name is Siti Aziza Nurhalimah Rais, and then my student ID is 33230129. Today I will be presenting my final exam for the syntax course. This presentation consists of two main parts. First, a discussion of relative clauses and subject auxiliary inversion, and second, an analysis of syntax tree diagrams from several sentences. Let's begin the presentation. First of all, what is a relative clause? A relative clause is a clause that gives extra information about a noun. Usually, a relative clause appears after the noun it describes. The main function of a relative clause is to make sentences more specific and detailed. By using relative clauses, we can provide clearer descriptions about the subject or object we're talking about. Now, let's look at the common relative pronouns. Relative pronouns are words that introduce a relative clause. There are several relative pronouns commonly used. Who is used to refer to people, which used to refer to things, that can be used to refer to either a people or things, and where used to refer to places. These are the words that will connect the relative clause to the noun it describes. Let's look at an example sentence using a relative clause. The example sentence is the girl who is wearing a red dress is dancing. In this sentence, the girl is the main noun. Who is wearing a red dress is the relative clause providing additional information. This relative clause explains which girl is dancing. So it's not just any girl, but specifically the girl wearing a red dress. With the relative clause, we know exactly which girl is being referred to. So, why do we use relative clause? There are several important functions. First, to add information about a noun, we can provide additional details without having to create a new sentence. Second, to avoid repeating sentences instead of making two separate sentences, we can combine them using a relative clause. Third, to make sentences clearer and more efficient, the information we convey becomes more concise yet still complete. So relative clauses are very helpful in making our communication more effective. Alright, after discussing relative clause, we'll now move on to the second topic in part 1, which is subject auxiliary inversion. So, what is subject auxiliary inversion? Subject auxiliary inversion occurs when the auxiliary verb is placed before the subject. This structure is very common in question and also in negative expression for emphasis. In other words, the normal order of subject and verb is reversed for specific purposes. Let's look at the difference between normal order and inversion. In a normal sentence, the order is she is happy. Here, subject she comes before the auxiliary verb is. However, when we form a question with inversion, the order becomes is she happy? The auxiliary verb is now placed before the subject she. So the auxiliary verb moves to a position before the subject. This is the characteristic feature in inversion. Now, let's look at an example of inversion in yes or no question. Normal sentence, they are coming. When changed into a question, are they coming? Here the auxiliary verb, are, switches position with the subject they. This is the standard way in English to form yes or no question. Without inversion, the sentence wouldn't sound like a question. Beside questions, inversion is also used in negative expressions to provide emphasis. For example, normal sentence, he has never seen it. with inversion for emphasis, never has he seen it. When a negative word like never is placed at the beginning of a sentence, we must performing inversion. This creates a dramatic effect and strong emphasis on the negative meaning. This structure is often used in formal writing or for rhetorical effect. Alright, let's conclude part 1. Relative clauses are structures that provide additional information about nouns, making our sentences more specific and efficient. Subject auxiliary inversion is a change in word order where the auxiliary verb is placed before the subject, commonly used in question and for emphasis. Both of these structures are very important in understanding English sentence structures and how we construct sentences correctly and effectively. Now, we'll move on to part 2 of this presentation. In the second part, I will analyze syntax tree diagram from 5 different sentences. We'll look at the deep structures analysis of each sentence. Let's start with the first sentence. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. In deep structures analysis, this sentence represents a simple subject-predicate relationship. The noun phrase, the quick brown fox, functions as the subject of the sentence. Here we have 3 adjectives, quick and brown, modifying the noun fox. The verb phrase, jumps over the lazy dog, functions as the predicate. Within this verb phrase, the prepositional phrase, over the lazy dog, acts as a complement of the verb jumps. What's interesting about this sentence is that no syntactic transformations occur. Therefore, the surface structure is identical to the deep structures. This is an example of straightforward sentence without any movement or transformation of its elements. The second sentence, the girl who is wearing a red dress is dancing. At the deep structures level, this sentence actually contains 2 prepositions. The girl is wearing a red dress and 2, the girl is dancing. In the analysis, the relative clause who is wearing a red dress modifies the noun girl and is attached to the noun phrase. The relative pronouns who originates as the subject of the embedded clause. This movement is a surface structures phenomenon, while the deep structure still retains to the full embedded clause. So there is a transformation process from deep structures to surface structure involving relativation. The third sentence, Zephano saw Yehezkiah with the telescope. This sentence is very interesting because it is structurally ambiguous. This ambiguity arises because the prepositional phrase with this telescope can attach to different constituents. There are 2 interpretations. First interpretation, the prepositional phrase functions as an instrument modifying the verb saw. This means Zephano used the telescope to see Yehezkiah. Second interpretation, the prepositional phrase functions as a modifier of the noun phrase, Yehezkiah. This means Yehezkiah is the person who is carrying or with the telescope. Each interpretation has a different deep structures, even though the surface structures remains the same. This demonstrates how one sentence can have more than one structural meaning. The fourth sentence, she believes that the earth is round. The deep structures of this sentence consist of 2 clauses. First, the main clauses, she believes. Here is a placeholder for what she believes. Second, the embedded clause. The earth is round. This is the content of her belief. In these structures, the embedded clause functions as the complement of the verb believe. The complementizer that introduced the embedded clause. What's important to note is that no syntactic movement occurs in this sentence. Therefore, the embedding of this clause is part of the deep structures. This is an example of standard clausal complementation. The fifth and final sentence, the house where I grew up has been demolished. At the deep structures level, this sentence contains a relative clause and a passive construction. The relative clause, where I grew up, modifies the noun house. This provides information about which house is being referred to. The main clause expresses a passive meaning, where the agent is not explicitly stated. We don't know who demolished the house. Although the passive form has been demolished, result from a syntactic transformation, the deep structure still includes an implicit agent, so there is an understanding that someone or something did the demolition even though it's not mentioned in the surface structures. Alright, that concludes my final exam syntax presentation. In this presentation, we have covered two main topics. In part 1, we learned about relative clauses that provide additional information about nouns, and subject auxiliary inversion that changes word order for question and emphasis. In part 2, we analyzed the deep structures of 5 sentences that demonstrate various syntactic phenomena such as relativization, structural ambiguity, clausal complementation, and the passive construction. Understanding these structures is crucial in studying English syntax and how meaning is constructed through sentence structure. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.